Bookcase TV is brought to you in part by Resident Magazine.
Cleveland having two, a single by Lou Boudreau in the first inning and a single by Raleigh Hensley in the second. Washington has only one base hit.
Sylvia, where's my calendar for tomorrow? I can't find my notes. I know I'm supposed to go to meet some writer. Sylvia?
Yeah?
Do you have my file for tomorrow? I think it was called Marklovich. Thank you. What the hell is a graphic novel? Sylvia, what is a graphic novel?
It's a comic book.
A comic book is a graphic novel? Why is it not called a comic book then?
I don't know.
There's something very strange about all this. And I'm supposed to be a place Comic Con? What's a con? I mean, people who con are just mobsters. We need to solve this mystery right away. Can you get me a car, Sylvia? Let's go.
Okay.
And inside, 3-1's a count now. Notice starts his wind up again. Here it comes.
This is Frederic Colier, and we are here for the Comic Con in New York. And again, we have tons of people walking in front of a camera. Max, if you can hear me. So let's talk about the new one.
Okay.
Legend of Zita the Special, right? Yeah. And what was the process? What was the inspiration behind this story in relation to the first book, which was Zita the Spacegirl?
Right. Well, the first book really tells the story of how this girl ended up wandering through space, trying to get home. The idea behind the second book is the fallout from the first book, because in saving her friend in the first book, she ends up saving a planet from destruction. At the beginning of the second book, she's dealing with the fallout of saving a planet from destruction, which is she's kind of famous. This is an unexpected thing for her. She's not really, she doesn't like, she lands on the planets, there's crowds, and this is startling. And when a robot crawls out of a junk pile and is able to look exactly like her, they switch places, just momentarily, so she can have a break. But then the robot decides it likes Zita's life. And when she comes back to the ship, they've left without her.
So talking about stories, you write your own stories, obviously. So what's the process like for graphic novels? Do you start with an outline for stories, obviously, and then you build around it? And, and when do you decide to do the drawings?
Especially in the second book, I learned the power of the outline and the power of the writing. It takes a year or more to finish one of these books. The outlining process is the safety net. I do try to leave a little bit of the meandering and the dialogue and the smaller events up to chance as I go. I'm working on the third one now, but the other day I pulled out some of the original art from the second book, and I almost wept with how many pages I had drawn and gotten to the inking, and they're nice-looking pages. They didn't get to the book. They didn't get into the book. You know, I almost did double the amount of pages that you see in the book. It was. I had a lot of ups and downs with the second one.
So they're pretty elaborate drawings. From the outline of the drawing itself to the end, I mean, it was still a year process.
Yeah, at least. The second one took a little longer than a year. The third one I'm finishing up because I did a better job outlining.
Okay.
It took about a solid year. So, but yeah, I put a lot into the art. I feel like I'm like, you're an artist and a storyteller, and the two are really the same, but I'm really comfortable with art. Because I started out doing illustration.
Is that how you okay? I was going to ask you my next question.
Yeah,
so your background is what? Just illustration, and you had you.
Well, I kind of have I started doing freelance illustration before I had any real training in art, and then when I decided I've got to figure out, I either have to stop doing this or learn a few things to, like increase my art or get a little better at this. I went to an atelier school in Florence and learned basically oil painting like the old masters, a little sculpture.
That was helpful?
It was. It's amazing that you wouldn't immediately think that it would translate into graphic novel or comics or illustration, but it was incredibly enriching.
It's a way of thinking, I suppose. It's
and training your eye, the eye to brain thing is a muscle, and it was really helpful. And just to get to spend a lot of time with figure and image and gesture and life drawing is incredible.
So the angle, the depth, the energy in the frame.
Get a feel for what light does over all the different surfaces. It's great. So I'd recommend like classical training.
So you, biggest or the most challenging aspect of this new book was what?
I think the storytelling, because like that's where I really started. Because the first book is maybe more of a classically structured children's story. It's a portal fantasy. You go to the other world, you do your mission, and then you go back. Or in her case, she doesn't go back. But the second one is a little murkier. It's got a lot more twists and turns. And so I think like learning to structure a story like that, or learning to pay off everything at the end and make it all end on the right note.
The more time you spend on the prep,
yes,
the easier, the faster you go on the drawings.
Right. Yeah, I'd say so. Yeah.
So the Macmillan is publishing. I mean,
yeah, first second of Macmillan.
Macmillan. How did that come about?
There were a group of artists. It's probably been like 10 years ago or so now that started a series of comics, the Flight anthologies, and these are like we were all young artists. Some of them were animators for DreamWorks or this and that. We all kind of shared a similar sensibility of storytelling, and at one point, Kazuo Kibuishi said, "Well, let's put together a book." They did a first volume, and then for me, art was always kind of a lonely thing because I didn't have a community of artists. But online, I got involved with this group, and then they invited me in for the second volume to do a short story. When I started working on the Zita story with First Second, I emailed and I said, I see that you're not doing submissions at this time, but I did the Flight books. I was wondering if you ever are accepting submissions, let me know. And they emailed right back and they're, well, actually, I felt like the Flight books, because they were respected from the artistic standpoint, were kind of like a little calling card. And they said, oh yeah, we'll just send it to us. And then they picked up the book. Yeah.
I hope there'll be the same outcome with those books and sell millions of copies.
Well, the third one is coming out, so
when is it coming out?
Probably next year.
Okay.
I'm finishing that now.
So what's the title?
The Return of Zita the Spacegirl.
Wow, I'm terrified at the news that she might be coming back.
Well, we'll see.
Thank you very much. We are with Ben Hatke today at Comic-Con. What's your name?
My name is Bane.
Bane? And what do you do for a living?
I break people in half.
Okay, and do you enjoy doing that?
It's a living.
Why Marvel Comics, not DC Comics? Why this story more interesting to you than the others?
Well, the thing that's really unique about Marvel Comics is that all of the characters sort of brush up against each other.
Are we talking characters? Are we talking...
the actual comic book
characters, yes.
Before you had The Wire and Breaking Bad and Mad Men, these really intricate narratives. You had Marvel Comics, where for years there were these interlocking storylines that made it really exciting for a reader.
So you decided, you woke up one morning and you were going to dive into this spider web and try to undo all the knots and arrows, or to unveil them?
Having grown up reading Marvel Comics, they have, in the letters columns, they have a real clubhouse feel. So you felt like you knew all the people who worked for the company. Growing up, it was almost like reading about extended family. The artists were people that you felt like you knew. Years later, when I started to realize that there were some other stories about these like surrogate uncles of mine, I wanted to find out that story as well.
So how much research involved doing this book? Because it's pretty substantial.
I mean, it's 30 years of reading comic books, first
that's
of all.
why it is. Okay, so let's start there. Okay.
Right, and then it's 3 years of just intensive research, interviewing, and writing.
But give us some example of great stories in this book. Is there anything that stands out, for example?
Stan Lee, who most people know as the face of Marvel, who was the editor there for decades, he worked very closely with Jack Kirby, who was an artist. They together created a lot of the major characters that we know in the movies. One thing that I was really surprised to learn was that Stan Lee and Jack Kirby had really become disillusioned with comic books. Stan Lee had actually tried to bring Jack Kirby out to Hollywood. It didn't happen at the time, but Jack Kirby and Stan Lee both eventually did move out there.
Disillusioned because of what? Of the style of graphics back then, or the style of stories, the business side of it?
The business side of it.
And so they got together and then decided to reshuffle everything?
Jack Kirby actually quit Marvel Comics. He went to work for the competition. Eventually he ended up doing animation work in Hollywood. Stan Lee, sort of in a parallel track, moved out to Hollywood and tried to get Marvel comic books made into movies.
Which is what's happening now.
which is finally happening now.
You think it's a good thing to bring those characters to the big screen?
I think it is.
Yeah?
Yeah, I think, what is good for Marvel Comics is good for the comics industry in general. Although I do think there's something that's lost in the movies. There's something that's unique and special about the artwork and the medium of comic books.
It's a different format, all in
Yeah,
all, yeah.
yeah. And so hopefully the people who are going to see these movies are also going to become interested in reading the comic books that they've never read.
And your book, hopefully too.
And hopefully my book.
It's an untold story because it's never been done before.
There's never been a comprehensive book about the history of Marvel Comics.
It's strange because it's such a big brand. Everyone knows Marvels, everyone knows the characters, and you would think about written some kind of PhD thesis or...
Right. Well, there probably are a lot of dissertations
Okay.
if you look for them. But in terms of a general audience book that holds together, traces the 70-year history of the company, that's never really been done.
So you covered from the inception, the guy starting in the bedroom, pretty much, to up to now.
Starting with, after Superman came out, there was a magazine publisher named Martin Goodman who thought it would be a good way to make some quick money. That was 1939, and now it's a multi-billion-dollar enterprise.
What have you gained from doing this book and research?
I'm in the part of the process where I'm delighted to be hearing from people who worked at Marvel Comics for 20 years and who are telling me that I've captured what it was really like, which is an unbelievable compliment. The lesson that I take from the Marvel story is really that people assign corporations with attributes like evil or just totally benevolent. I feel like the Marvel Comics story hammers home that it's in flux, and it depends on who's running the company at any given time, and you can't count on a company to maintain a certain goodness or badness forever. It's always very fluid. The story of Marvel Comics is the story of art versus commerce, and art holding hands with commerce at certain times.
Yeah. It's interesting because in comics and in Marvel, the corporation is always an evil entity very often, and yet your experience to be contradictory to that.
Well, it's just that it's not that simple.
It's not simple. Of course not. It's nothing black and white.
You could also say that you can't trust corporations. That's also very true.
How much access were you given to the archives, if they had any?
I spoke to a few people at Marvel who currently work there now. Most of the archival work that I did was independent. It's Disney, so there are limits on how much they're going to fling open the doors for other people.
Even though it's unofficial book or unauthorized, whatever they want to call it, were they receptive to the project?
They were cooperative. They were not hostile. I'm not sure if they preferred that the book was happening or not, but they were very, very respectful. And
there's no bad press. I mean, the fact you talk about it and it's out there, it's...
Yeah, I don't think I'm making any claims that are too outrageous.
Are there mermaids in the Hudson?
There is a mermaid in the Hudson now.
Where does she live?
Good question. There's a bend in the river that's just south of West Point. To this day is the most dangerous bend in the river. The ground down there is littered with shipwrecks from every era. This plays into the story, obviously.
Was the inception or the initial point of it?
That was part of the beginning. That was part of my love affair with the Hudson River. Discovering the strange facts and the folklore surrounding the Hudson River, going back to Washington Irving and then Indian tales as well. The Indians called the river Mohicantuck, which was the river that flows two ways. That plays into the story as well. The basic premise began with a little doodle I did on a train ride. I work in Manhattan, I live up along the Hudson. One morning I drew a little doodle of a captain speaking to a mermaid. I had this conversation appear in my notebook at an interesting time in my life, at around age 37. That's the age of the captain in the story. This conversation between this captain and this mermaid evolved, and then another character came into these early doodles, a Frenchman with a big nose, and his name's Lafayette. And this captain who would later become called Twain, and Lafayette became the first two major characters in what built into a story with many layers and mysteries, and of course a mermaid.
I know a little bit about your background as an editor, working for other people's. What was it like to work the other way around?
Part of my schooling as an editor was working with my agent, Tanya McKinnon, who acted really as my first editor in a sense. And she came into this process when I was at an early stage of fleshing out my characters and I thought I had a story. And she started asking me very pointed questions, lots and lots of them. And she drove me into not just the research about the history of the Hudson Valley and New York in 1887, but also researching my characters, the innards of the story, you know. And of course she had me reading a lot of 19th century. So we were into Wilkie Collins. Anna Karenina, we spent months taking apart and looking at the the architecture of it.
Okay.
You know? And basically over time and over the first few years, I worked out this script.
Why not turning your research into a novel? Why a graphic novel?
I've always pursued both the writing and the artwork as kind of twin pursuits, twin passions. But in this case, you'll see there's a lot of the storytelling is handled in dialogue, but a lot of it, the dialogue disappears and there's a theater of faces, a theater of posture, there's the unspoken and unseen things between characters as their relationships transform. And all this needed to be handled in this kind of comics medium. So when I picked up a piece of charcoal, it suddenly started coming alive, you know, and I drew a steamboat and it just, like, part of it was just vanishing in the mist, and I thought, like, that's it, that's the Sailor Twain mood.
How long was it, what sort of timeline are we talking about after the writing of the script?
It was 4 or 5
forward?
years with a lot of surrounding historical research. I developed a working script that I was happy with over the course of about 4 years. The next 5 years were spent really taking that script and bashing it in every possible way, squeezing it, stripping a lot of it off. Then something interesting happened. Was I was working in these charcoal pages, and early on I thought it would be fun to serialize this thing. So I tried serializing it online. So I put it up, 1 page every Monday, Wednesday, Friday.
Oh, okay, it's a lot.
And I had no idea if people would come in. And mine didn't become one of the top most visited, but it was still about 800,000 unique readers.
That's a number.
You know, all kinds of strange magic happened because of doing that webcomic.
So another book, another 10 years?
Possibly. I'm not scared of it if it needs to be. Some projects, I think, are luxury projects. This wasn't one of those. This was born from a real need to balance something, a little bit like an oyster with an irritant that it needs to, you know, it can't get rid of it. It has to do something with it. And then the whole exploration of mermaids, for me, was not an academic thing. It was real life, not in terms of fish women, you know, immediately, but the mermaid's song, the call of a mermaid.
In the Odysseys.
Yeah, well, so Ulysses ties himself to the mast,
yeah.
Right? He wants to hear this beautiful song that he knows he will follow it to his death. So I started asking myself, in our lives, you know, what are those mermaid songs?
It's 10 years later. How are you dealing with your own mermaids' voices?
Well, that's the beauty of a project, you know. It moved from like a kind of first stage of personal therapy, which I think if it stayed at that, would have been a lesser project. But then it moved into really exploring a story and crafting a story and trying to push that story far enough to hit to some truth about it.
Do you feel more at peace with the world or yourself, or more boosting your confidence in your craft?
I suppose a little bit of confidence has grown. Some of the inner turbulence, the turmoil that's provoked the story, that particular turmoil, I feel I've kind of, in the course of this project and just playing out some of the choices that I didn't make in my life and taking them to their fullest conclusion, I felt like something I could let go of. You know, maybe, hopefully like the oyster letting go of that pearl at the end.
No, the world is your oyster, no?
We'll see about that.
We
the next mermaid is
voices,
calling.
That's right.
I'm here, Freddy.
I can't read this stuff. This makes no sense. A man was arrested in Times Square. for spraying people who he thought were trying to contaminate him into becoming a superhero, only because he suffered from vertigo and did not want to fly across the sky and climb skyscraper and leap over bridges? What kind of news is that? Let's talk instead about a different kind of treatment called Comixology. So let's talk about Comixology and the reason why you had Comic-Con.
We have the largest digital library with over almost 30,000 comics for sale. We have approximately 900 free comics that you can download. Every Wednesday you can buy Marvel, DC, Dynamite, Boom, Image, Zenescope comics as the same time that you can buy them in print.
The people like to read better on the digital download as opposed to paper?
What we've seen is that there are a lot of people in this country that live more than 50 miles away from a comic book store. So the logistics of even getting to a comic book store may be too great for some people.
How do you secure the rights to do the download with all those publishers, because there's so many of them out there?
When it came time to do digital comics, we already had relations with people. They already trusted us. We had a great technology. It was just a simple matter of, winning them over.
So you mentioned you are one of the co-founders. What is your task within the company?
I'm the technical co-founder.
Technical, okay, so IT.
So when we first started the company, there were 3 of us. I handled all the graphic design, I handled all the development, I designed the logo, I came up with the name, I handled all of the site functionality, the look and feel of the website. I handled all of that. And then as we grew, I started getting more into how can we evolve the telling of digital comics and working with creators. I have a lot of good relationship with creators, so I was able to leverage that and say, hey, we've known each other for a while. I really like what you're doing. You should be distributing on our application. And we just announced Comixology Submit, which is our creator portal that allows creators to submit comics to be included on the Comixology platform.
This is brand new.
Brand new. We announced it on Thursday. It's going to allow people for the first time to have the ability to be on the Comixology platform that wouldn't normally have that opportunity.
Was there a time when you felt like this is not going to work?
Never. What we wanted to do was build something that we would use, right? So when we look at this application and we see that there's a problem that we do not like, we take the time and effort to fix it because we know we want to use it. And if we want to use it in a certain way, we know other people want to use it.
Sure, yeah, make it very accessible. See what I mean? Now we're talking about real superhero. And remember, reading blows your mind. I've just been in the future, and you will not believe things I've seen. Let me give you an example. There's a book about the Carter family. You know them all. There's a country singer, the one that made hundreds of recordings and some millions of albums, but the book is about their journey from being nobodies to respectabilities. It's a very emotional journey. It comes also with a disc, which is very small, and you put inside the machine, and it plays on a big screen very, very loud. So the Carter family, don't forget this song by Frank Young and David Lasky, make superb graphic novels. The next book I found at Comic-Con was a graphic novel by Fred Howe called Johnny Hero. It's a story of a young boss boy called Johnny. This Johnny Hero lives in Brooklyn and struggles as a boss boy in a restaurant, and he has a girlfriend called Miyaomi and has to face the local mobster and people becoming like samurai. And it really talks about coming of age stories. It's a journey on how to become an adult. Check it out, great drawings, full of energy, nice framed. Johnny Hero by Fred Howe. The next book was by a Chinese writer I met there. His name is Li Kun-Wu. The book itself is a very intimate portrayal of the artist's 30 years status as the official artist of the Communist Party. He talks about a lot of his neighbors and colleagues and friends and family, and also the controversial clashes within the apparatus of the Chinese Communist Party. So it's a very lovely book, thick, epic, like The Chinese Life by Ling Kut-Wu. The last book I found at Comic-Con in New York was a book by someone called Glenn Dillon. It talks about a half American, half Japanese girl who suffers from OCD. And when she feels the compulsion to hurt people, to harm them very badly in very violent ways, she's haunted by those graphic images of violence. She falls for this, what we call now a loser who takes care of a washing machine. And through the process of meditation, now learn that life is not black and white and not violent, but rather brown. So The Now of Brown by Gil Dillon, lovely book of graphic novels.